Arizona Territory, 1885. The crack of a rifle split the night air as three shadowy figures led a magnificent black stallion away from a small ranch house on the edge of Whispering Canyon. "She won't follow," one whispered. "Not after that warning. Shot." What the Blackwell gang didn't realize, what would soon become their fatal mistake, was that the slender figure watching from the darkened doorway was far more than just another struggling widow trying to keep her small ranch alive. For nearly 15 years, Catherine Harmon had been the most feared tracker in the Southwestern Territories, known in hushed whispers as Ghost Feet, a woman who could outrun horses across the harshest terrain and track a man for hundreds of miles without rest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn painted the rugged Arizona landscape in hues of amber and gold as Catherine Harmon stood motionless in the doorway of her modest ranch house. At 42, her face bore the weathered lines of someone who had spent a lifetime under the merciless desert sun, but her eyes remained sharp as a hawk's, tracking the distant dust cloud that marked the Blackwell gang's retreat. Her chestnut hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was pulled back in a tight braid, and her calloused hands clenched into fists at her sides. Thunder, her prized black stallion and the last gift from her late husband James, was now disappearing over the mesa's edge. The horse wasn't just an animal. He was her lifeline, her only means of transporting water and supplies across miles of unforgiving terrain, and her last connection to the life she'd built with James before the typhoid took him 2 years ago. Catherine's breath caught as anger and determination fused in her chest. The Blackwell gang had stolen from the wrong woman. She moved with practiced efficiency, gathering essentials for the pursuit. From beneath a loose floorboard, she retrieved a worn leather pouch containing tracking tools she hadn't touched in years. A small brass compass, a weathered map marked with watering holes and hidden passages through the territory, and a curved hunting knife with initials carved into the handle. C.H. Sheriff William Porter's voice called from outside, followed by the sound of his horse approaching. "Mrs. Harmon heard a shot last night." The aging lawman dismounted, his weathered face creased with concern as Catherine emerged from her house. "Blackwell gang," she stated flatly, securing a small canteen to her belt. "3 riders. Took Thunder." Porter's expression darkened. "Damn. Those boys have been hitting ranches from here to the Colorado border, already killed 2 ranch hands in Mesa Springs last month." He hesitated, watching as Catherine checked the soles of her moccasin-style boots, uniquely designed with layers of rawhide and rabbit fur. "Mrs. Harmon, I strongly advise against whatever you're thinking. These men are killers." A ghost of a smile touched Catherine's lips. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff." Porter studied her carefully. They'd known each other for many years, since before she'd married James and settled in Whispering Canyon. "Been a long time since anyone's whispered that name," he said quietly. "Ghost Feet. That life is behind me." Catherine secured her long knife to her thigh, concealed beneath her skirt. "But they didn't steal from Ghost Feet. They stole from Catherine Harmon." "That makes it personal." Porter shifted uncomfortably. "Blackwell's men are scattered across 3 counties. Network of hideouts, spotters in every town. They've evaded every posse sent after them." "Puzzies make noise, William. Follow obvious trails." Catherine pulled rawhide laces tight around her ankles. "I'm just one woman, and I haven't forgotten how to move silently. At least let me send telegrams to the other sheriffs, organize a proper—" "No," Catherine cut him off firmly. "By the time your telegrams are answered, they'll have crossed Thunder into New Mexico or sold him to some unsuspecting rancher. This needs to be handled now, and it needs to be handled my way." Porter recognized the steel in her tone. The same quiet certainty she'd carried in her tracking days when she'd find men that had eluded every lawman in the territory. "They're watching the obvious routes," he warned. "Probably have men posted at key passes and watering holes." "Let them watch the passes," Catherine replied, taking a final inventory of her sparse provisions. "I learned to track in this desert long before the Blackwells thought to hide in it." She stepped out into the morning sun, her eyes already reading the subtle signs in the dirt that most would miss. The depth of hoofprints indicating Thunder's resistance, the pattern of the horse's gaits, the small scraps of evidence the gang had unwittingly left behind. "I've known you nearly 20 years, Catherine," Porter said, his voice dropping. "Known you since you were that half-wild girl the Apache found and raised after the Comanche raid that took your parents. I saw what tracking those men did to you." Catherine's eyes hardened at the mention of her past. "This isn't about revenge." "William, then what is it about?" "Survival." She gestured to her small ranch. "Without Thunder, I can't haul water from the spring, can't transport goods to town. Everything I've built here dies." She paused, looking toward the distant mountains. "James wanted this place to thrive. I won't let it wither because of men like Blackwell." Porter studied her for a long moment. There was something both familiar and foreign in Catherine's demeanor. The focused hunter he'd known years ago, tempered by the steady rancher she'd become. "Give me 3 days," she told him. "If you haven't heard from me by then, send your telegrams, but you won't need to." "These men, Catherine," Porter said quietly, "they're killers, cold-blooded." "No, William," her voice carried the chill of a desert night. "They're thieves who haven't met the right hunter yet." She knelt, gently touching the disturbed earth where Thunder had been led away. "But they're about to." As Catherine set off across the parched landscape, Porter watched her, figure grow smaller against the vast terrain. Her stride was already changing, transforming from a rancher's practical gait to something more fluid, more purposeful, the legendary pace that had earned her the name Ghost Feet. He'd seen that same measured determination 15 years ago, when she was the most feared tracker in the territories. The Blackwell gang thought they'd stolen a horse from a widow's ranch. Instead, they'd awakened something far deadlier, a legend they'd thought was just campfire stories. Ghost Feet was back on the hunt, and this time it wasn't about bounties. This was about justice, survival, and the bond between a woman and the last connection to the life she'd built from nothing. As Catherine created the first ridge, her eyes picked up signs invisible to others: a bent cactus spine, disturbed rocks, the subtlest impression of hooves in the hard-packed soil. The desert was speaking to her in a language few remembered, telling a story of arrogant men who believed their tracks would vanish like morning mist. They were about to learn why even the most hardened outlaws had once checked their back trail and slept with one eye open when word spread that Ghost Feet was hunting them, because Catherine Harmon hadn't just been good at tracking outlaws. She had been a phantom across the desert, a whispered name that made killers tremble, a hunter who could run for days without rest and appear like a mirage where least expected. Now, as she settled into the ground-eating lope that had made her legendary, Catherine felt the familiar focus settling over her, the quiet certainty that had defined her former life sharp as ever. The Blackwell gang had a day's head start, but they were riding stolen horses through a country they barely knew. She had been born to this harsh land, had learned its secrets from the Apache who'd found her half dead beside her slaughtered parents. Every cactus formation, every hidden water source, every subtle change in the desert wind, they all told. A story to those who knew how to listen. The hunt was on, and this time there would be no bounties claimed, only justice served under the unforgiving Arizona sun. The midday sun blazed mercilessly as Catherine moved with the rhythm of the land, her pace unbroken since dawn. Where others would have sought shade and rest, she pressed forward, her eyes continually scanning the terrain. The distinctive gait of Thunder's hoofprints told her the stallion was still resisting his captors, creating a trail clearer than the Blackwell gang realized. At a rocky outcropping, Catherine paused, noting where the gang had stopped briefly. Discarded cigarette papers caught in a creosote bush, still fragrant enough to be from this morning. A coffee tin tossed carelessly aside. She knelt, touching the disturbed earth with experienced fingers. One of the riders was heavier than the others, his horse struggling under the weight, leaving deeper impressions. The second rider's horse had a unique pattern to its gait, slight favoring of the right foreleg. The third rider kept Thunder close, probably using a lead rope. "Sloppy," she murmured, noting how they'd made no effort to conceal their trail. Either they didn't expect pursuit, or they didn't fear it. Both assumptions would prove fatal. Catherine removed her worn boots, examining the specially designed soles. The Apache had taught her this trick, layers of rawhide and rabbit fur that cushioned her steps while protecting against the scorching sand and sharp rocks. These boots had carried her thousands of miles across the territories, earning her the name that still echoed in frontier legends. A distant plume of dust caught her attention, riders approaching from the direction of town. Catherine melted into the shadow of a large boulder, her dun-colored clothing blending perfectly with the desert landscape. Through narrowed eyes, she recognized Frank Taylor's wagon, likely headed to his claim near Rattlesnake Gulch. As the wagon drew closer, Catherine stepped into view, raising a hand in greeting. Frank pulled his team to a halt, surprise evident. On his sun-weathered face, "Mrs. Harmon, what in tarnation are you doing out here alone?" His eyes took in her tracking gear and the determined set of her jaw. "Heard about your horse? Sheriff Porter's mighty concern." "Which route did the Blackwells take after hitting the Williams place last month?" Catherine asked, ignoring his concern. Frank's expression darkened. "North through Devil's Backbone, then east toward the old mining camps." He hesitated. "There's talk they've got a new operation. Not just horse thieving anymore." "What kind of operation?" "Rumors say they're supplying remounts for bank robbers across the territory. Quick getaway horses stationed at strategic points." Frank leaned forward, lowering his voice, though no one was within miles. "Some say they've got a man inside the U.S. Marshal's office. That's how they stay ahead of the law." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Catherine absorbed this information, adding it to her mental map. "Anyone in particular been asking questions about my ranch recently?" "About Thunder?" Frank's eyes widened slightly. "Come to think of it, there was a fella in Holloway's saloon last week, well-dressed for these parts. Asked specific questions about prized horses in the area." He frowned. "Mention your stallion by name." "Did he now?" Catherine said, her voice cooling. "Anything else I should know?" Frank shifted uncomfortably. "They weren't just asking about horses. Wanted to know about you specifically. If you lived alone, if you had family nearby or regular visitors." His eyes met hers. "And one more thing, Mrs. Harmon. Fellow had a distinctive scar across his left cheek. Reminded me of something I hadn't thought about in years." Catherine went still. "What's that?" "Stories about ghost feet. How she marked the leader of the Comanche raiding party that killed her family. Cut him across the face before he escaped." Frank studied her carefully. "That was you, wasn't it? Before the Apache found you?" Catherine didn't answer directly. "This man with the scar, did he give a name?" "Called himself Jackson, but one of his companions slipped up, calling him Blackwell." A cold certainty settled in Catherine's chest. "Not one of the gang?" "The leader." Frank nodded slowly. "Seems your stallion wasn't just another theft of opportunity. They came looking specifically for your horse." He hesitated. "And maybe for you." Catherine processed this revelation, the pieces shifting in her mind. "Thank you, Frank. I'd appreciate it if you'd keep our meeting between us." "Course." He gathered his reins. Be careful, Mrs. Harmon. Ghost Feet was a legend, but legends don't stop bullets. As Frank's wagon continued toward his claim, Catherine altered her course slightly. If Ezra Blackwell himself had been asking questions, this wasn't just about stealing a valuable horse. The coincidence was too great, the leader of the gang bearing the same distinctive scar she'd given a Comanche raider 15 years ago. Memory surfaced like a desert flash flood. A young Catherine, barely 17, watching from a hidden space beneath the floorboards as Comanche raiders slaughtered her homesteader parents. The moment she'd lunged out with her father's hunting knife, catching the leader across the face before being knocked unconscious. The days of delirium that followed as she staggered through the desert until the Apache found her. More dead than alive. Catherine pushed the memories aside. Speculation wouldn't change her immediate goal, recovering Thunder, but it added urgency to her pursuit. If Blackwell was indeed the Comanche raider she'd marked all those years ago, he wouldn't have forgotten either. The terrain gradually changed as Catherine moved north, rocky soil giving way to the distinctive red clay of the region locals called Devil's Backbone, a treacherous ridge of wind-carved formations stretching 20 miles along a natural watershed. Few travelers attempted crossing it directly. Most circled around, adding days to their journey. Catherine went straight in, her practiced eye finding natural pathways invisible to casual observation. The Apache had shown her these routes, ancient trails used by their people for generations. As she navigated a particularly narrow passage, fresh signs caught her attention. Cigarette ash, not yet scattered by wind. Boot prints showing where someone had dismounted, perhaps to rest horses or check their bearings, hours, not days old. The gang was slowing, likely believing themselves safe in this treacherous terrain. At a small seep spring hidden among the rocks, Catherine found more telling evidence. Thunder had pulled free briefly, his distinctive hoofprints showing a short burst of freedom before being recaptured. The ground told the story clearly. A struggle, a man thrown to the ground, angry boot prints circling in frustration. "Good boy," she whispered, pride mixing with renewed determination. Thunder was making their journey difficult, just as she'd trained him to do with strangers. By late afternoon, Catherine reached a vantage point overlooking a vast expanse of the territory. In the distance, thin smoke rose from what appeared to be an abandoned mining claim, the Forsaken Lady, closed after a deadly collapse 5 years earlier, a strategic location, offering shelter while being officially uninhabited. Through the clear desert air, she could make out movement. Horses in a makeshift corral, men moving between rough structures. Too far to identify individuals, but enough to confirm her suspicions. The Blackwell operation was larger than simple horse thieving. The number of animals in that corral suggested systematic acquisition and holding. As Catherine assessed her approach options, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her melt into the shadows of a large boulder. A lone rider appeared on the trail below, moving at an easy pace. The man wore the distinctive badge of a deputy, U.S. Marshal, but something about his manner raised Catherine's suspicions. He rode directly toward the abandoned mine with the confidence of someone expected, not someone investigating. "Their man inside the marshal's office," she murmured, watching as he was greeted without challenge at the camp's perimeter. Catherine settled deeper into her observation point, prepared to watch and learn. The sun would set in a few hours, bringing the merciful cool of desert night. While most travelers would make camp, she would continue. The night had always been her ally, and her Apache-trained eyes could read signs by starlight that others couldn't see at noon. The Blackwell gang believed the harsh terrain and their inside connections made them untouchable. They were about to learn that the desert had a long memory, and Ghost Feet had an even longer one. Twilight painted the desert in deepening shades of purple as Catherine maintained her vigil above the Forsaken Lady mine. The camp below had come, alive with activity, men moving between buildings, horses being tended, supplies unloaded from wagons. By her count, there were at least 15 men, far more than the Blackwell gang's known numbers. The corrupt deputy marshal had joined what appeared to be a strategy meeting in the largest structure, formerly the mine's office. Through her father's old brass spyglass, Catherine studied the gathering. 5 men clustered around a table, spread with what looked like maps. At the center stood a tall figure whose bearing commanded attention. Ezra Blackwell himself, even at this distance, the scar across his left cheek was visible, a pale slash against sun-darkened skin. Catherine's hand unconsciously moved to the hunting knife at her thigh, the same blade that had marked him all those years ago, though neither had known then that fate would bring them full circle. As darkness fell completely, small fires sprang up around the camp. Catherine used the deepening shadows to shift position, working her way silently down the ridge toward the abandoned structures on the mine's periphery. The skill with which she moved, each footfall precisely placed, her silhouette never breaking. The skyline reflected years of Apache training enhanced by natural talent. Near an outlying shed, Catherine paused, hearing voices. 2 men, their silhouettes backlit by a distant fire. 8 more coming tomorrow, one said, striking a match against his boot. Jackson's bringing them from the Holloway Purchase. That banker fellow coming too? The second man asked. Yep, bringing. And papers for those territorial grazing leases. Once they're registered, we control the water rights for 3 counties. Smart play. Can't drive cattle without water. Blackwell's thinking bigger than horses now. This is about controlling the whole. Damn territory, the first man laughed low. Territorial marshal's office in his pocket, banks handling the money, and us running the operation on the ground. Next year, we'll be legitimate businessmen. What about the widow's stallion, worth all this trouble? That beast. It's the bloodstock. Blackwell wants fastest horse in the territory, perfect for our remount stations. Plus, the man's voice dropped, but Catherine's keen hearing caught his words. Personal matter between Blackwell and her, the way I hear it. Something from years back. Catherine waited until they moved on before slipping closer to the main structures. Thunder would be in the corral with the other stolen horses, but approaching. Directly would be suicidal with so many men about. She needed to understand more about their operation first. Weaknesses, patterns, schedules. A flicker of movement near the main building caught her attention. A slender figure emerging from the shadows. Not one of the gang, but a woman in worn, a frontier dress. Catherine watched as she carried water buckets toward the bunkhouse, her movements suggesting reluctance or fear. Changing course, Catherine ghosted through the darkness, intercepting the woman behind a stack of mining equipment. She clamped one hand over the woman's mouth before she could cry out. "I mean no harm," Catherine whispered. "I'm looking for a stolen horse." The woman's terrified eyes gradually steadied as Catherine slowly removed her hand. "You're her," the woman whispered. "The one they're talking about, the tracker. Who are you?" "Ruth Parker. They raided our homestead last month and killed my husband when he resisted." Her voice was hollow with grief. "Brought me here to cook and clean for their operation." "I'm sorry about your husband," Catherine said softly. "Are there others like you?" "2 more women from raided homesteads. They keep us separate, thinking we might plot something." Ruth glanced nervously toward the main building. "You shouldn't be here. Blackwell has men everywhere. And that marshal, Deputy Marshal Davis." "I saw him arrive," Ruth nodded. "He brings information, warns them about lawmen's movements. But he's not the only one. There's talk of a banker involved, someone with political connections." Catherine processed this information. "My stallion, black with a white blaze. Where are they keeping him?" "The special stock is in the separate corral behind the assay office. Your Thunder is there, but..." Ruth hesitated. "What? They can't handle him, already injured." Blackwell's furious, wants to break him personally. Pride mingled with concern in Catherine's chest. When? Tomorrow. Some big meeting is happening. Territorial officials arriving with the banker? Ruth clutched Catherine's arm suddenly. There's more. They've got a boy. Catherine went still. A child, son of the marshal from Copper Springs, taking him to force his father to look the other way on some land deal, keeping him in the old foreman's quarters. This changed things. Catherine had come for her horse, but a child in danger altered priorities. How many men guard him? Just one, usually. They don't expect anyone to know he's here. Ruth's eyes pleaded. His name is Matthew. He's only 10. Catherine made a quick decision. Can you get a message to the women's camp in the foothills? The Apache settlement led by Grey Dove. Ruth's eyes widened. The Indian camp, I might. Sometimes they let me gather herbs on the ridge. Tell Grey Dove that Ghost Feet calls for the old alliance. She'll understand. Hope flickered in Ruth's eyes. You know the Apache? They raised me after my family was killed. Grey Dove was like a mother. Understanding dawned on Ruth's face. The stories about Ghost Feet being raised by Apache are true. Now tell me everything about the camp's routine. Guard changes, who goes where, when they sleep. As Ruth detailed the operations patterns, Catherine built a mental map. The camp followed military-like precision. Blackwell ran his gang with discipline unusual for outlaws. Guards changed every 4 hours. The horses were checked at dawn and dusk. Supply wagons arrived on specific days. The corrupt deputy marshal brought information weekly. Tomorrow's meeting is important, Ruth finished. Some territorial commissioner, the banker from Prescott, and that marshal. Something about water rights and railroad land grants. Where is it happening? Main building, midday. Ruth glanced toward the camp. I should go. They'll miss me. Catherine nodded. If you can reach Grey Dove, do it. If not, stay safe. When this is over, I'll make sure you and the other women are returned home. As Ruth hurried away, Catherine retreated to higher ground, processing what she'd learned. The Blackwell operation wasn't just about stolen horses. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise with political connections, aimed at controlling the territory's resources. The stolen horses, including Thunder, were just one piece of a larger scheme. More troubling was the kidnapped boy. Catherine couldn't leave a child in danger, even if it complicated her recovery of Thunder. The Apache had taught her that protecting the innocent came before personal concerns. She made her way to a vantage point overlooking both corrals. In the smaller one, separated from the main herd, stood Thunder, his proud silhouette unmistakable, even in darkness. The stallion paced restlessly, refusing to settle like the other horses. Soon, she whispered, though the wind carried her words away. Catherine settled into a protected hollow among the rocks, preparing for a few hours of rest before the pre-dawn hours when the camp would be at its most vulnerable. Tomorrow would require all her skills, not just tracking and moving unseen, but strategy and timing. The Blackwell gang had created something more dangerous than a simple outlaw operation. They were building a power structure that could corrupt the entire territory, using violence and political manipulation to control land, water, and transportation. As she closed her eyes for a brief rest, Catherine's mind worked through approaches and contingencies. Getting to Thunder would be challenging enough. Adding a child's rescue complicated matters exponentially. But the presence of important visitors tomorrow offered opportunities as well as obstacles. Sometimes the most effective. Strategy wasn't the direct approach. The Apache had taught her that too. The false dawn cast ghostly light across the desert landscape as Catherine moved through the shadows surrounding the forsaken Lady Mine. She'd rested just enough to restore her energy while remaining alert, a skill honed during years of tracking dangerous men across unforgiving terrain. Now she circled the outskirts of the camp, invisible in the pre-morning gloom, studying guard positions and movement patterns. 2 men guarded the main entrance, slumped and drowsy after the long night. "Watch!" A third patrolled the perimeter with a lantern, his circuit predictable to the minute. The separate corral where Thunder was kept had its own guard, a young man who repeatedly checked his pocket watch, eager for his replacement, Catherine surmised. Most revealing was the position of a sharpshooter on the roof of the old assay office, a Springfield rifle across his lap as he surveyed the approaches. Blackwell was expecting trouble, though perhaps not from a single woman who could move like desert mist. Catherine paused at a ridge overlooking the eastern approach to the mine. If Ruth had managed to get word to Grey Dove, there might be a signal. Before full sunrise, the Apache never attacked directly. Their way was subtlety and distraction, creating opportunities rather than confrontations. A faint flicker of light caught her attention, 3 quick flashes from a distant hill. Pause, then 2 more. The old signal, one she hadn't seen in years. Grey Dove had received the message and acknowledged the alliance. Catherine felt momentary relief, knowing she wasn't entirely alone. She continued her circuit, eventually finding the foreman's quarters where the boy was supposedly held. Through a grimy window, she could make out a small figure curled on a cot, a man dozing in a chair nearby. Matthew, the marshal's son, appeared unharmed but clearly frightened, even in sleep. As she watched, the camp began stirring with early morning activity. Men emerged from bunkhouses, fires were stoked, coffee brewed. The operation ran with military precision, another sign of Blackwell's unusual leadership. Most outlaw gangs were chaotic, but this one operated like a well-oiled machine. Catherine retreated to higher ground as full daylight approached, unwilling to risk detection. From her vantage point, she observed supply wagons being prepared, horses tended, and what appeared to be preparations for the important meeting later. Tables and chairs were arranged in the main building, documents spread out, maps pinned to walls. By mid-morning, new arrivals began appearing. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit accompanied by 2 armed guards, his bearings suggesting both wealth and authority. This would be the banker Ruth had mentioned. Shortly after came another wagon bearing official territorial government markings, from which emerged a portly man wearing a badge of office, some kind of commissioner. Most interesting was the arrival of a stagecoach under heavy guard. 4 armed men escorted a slender, distinguished gentleman with silver hair and a bearing that spoke of Eastern education and influence. The difference shown by others confirmed this must be someone of significant importance. Planning quite a gathering, aren't you, Blackwell? Catherine murmured to herself, counting nearly 30 men now in the camp. Whatever transaction was occurring today involved more than simple horse theft or local corruption. This had territorial implications. A noise behind her froze Catherine in place, the subtle displacement of a small stone. She reached for her, knife without turning, muscles tensed for conflict. "The snake strikes only when threatened," came a soft voice in Apache. "The ghost walks without disturbing even the sand." Catherine relaxed slightly, recognizing the traditional greeting. She turned to find a young Apache woman, perhaps 20, her clothing a mixture of traditional and frontier styles. "I am Sparrow," the woman said quietly in English. "Grey Dove's granddaughter. She sends me with eyes to see and ears to hear." "I'm grateful," Catherine replied. "Your grandmother was my teacher when I had lost everything." Sparrow nodded. "She still speaks of you still. Ghost Feet, the white girl who ran like wind and moved like shadow." Her eyes held respect beyond her years. "Our scouts watch all approaches to this place. They are many and armed well." "Too many for direct action," Catherine agreed. "But numbers can be a weakness as well as a strength. Tell me what your people have observed." Sparrow settled beside her, pointing out details Catherine had missed. A hidden cache of weapons in an abandoned shaft, the pattern of patrols that changed subtly each day, the way certain men deferred to others, indicating a hierarchy beyond. The obvious. The important men arriving, Sparrow continued, they bring papers for water rights along the Little Thunder River. The banker holds debts of many ranches there. If they control the water, they control everything, Catherine finished. Cattle can't survive without it. Crops wither. People are forced to sell or abandon their homesteads. There is more. My people have seen maps in their camp. Places marked for dams, places where the river could be diverted. Sparrow's eyes darkened, including the waters that feed our settlement. The implications chilled Catherine. This wasn't just criminal opportunity. It was systematic displacement of both settlers and native peoples. Control of water in the Arizona Territory meant control of life itself. "What of the boy?" Catherine asked. "One guard only changed at midday. The child is bait to control his father, who stands against their water plans." Sparrow's expression grew troubled. "They will not keep him alive once the papers are signed." Catherine absorbed this. "And my stallion?" The black one fights them still. The scarred man, Blackwell, comes himself to break its spirit this morning. He brings a special whip. Sparrow made a gesture toward the main corral, where Catherine could now see Blackwell approaching Thunder with what appeared to be a quirt, a short, flexible whip used to subdue difficult animals. Anger flared in Catherine's chest, but she suppressed it. Emotion clouded judgment, another lesson from her. "Apache mentors, what does Grey Dove suggest?" she asked, knowing the old woman's tactical wisdom was legendary among her people. Sparrow smiled slightly. "She says the ghost should not fight 30 men. Instead, let 30 men fight each other." Catherine understood immediately. Create conflict within their ranks. Their alliance is strong in appearance only. The banker distrusts the lawman. The territorial official fears exposure. The scarred one trusts no one. Sparrow reached into a small pouch at her waist. "Grey Dove sends these." She handed Catherine several small items, a pouch of dried herbs, a tiny stoppered clay bottle, and what appeared to be a specially carved wooden whistle. The herbs create smoke that causes confusion when thrown on fire. The liquid induces sleep when mixed with food or drink. The whistle, Sparrow demonstrated by blowing through it, producing no sound audible to human ears. "Horses here, it frightens them." Catherine accepted the gifts with deep gratitude. Grey Dove had always understood that victory came through intelligence rather than force, especially when outnumbered. "There is one more thing," Sparrow said, her voice lowering. "Our hunters found 2 men dead at the crossing of Bitter Creek yesterday. Lawmen from the territorial capital. Their documents were taken. Blackwell covering his tracks," Catherine mused. "Or eliminating potential opposition before this meeting." Sparrow nodded grimly. "Some of our young men wish to attack directly. Grey Dove prevents this, saying it would bring soldiers against our people, but she offers distraction when you need it." Catherine studied the camp below, her mind working through possibilities. "The meeting begins at midday?" "When the sun stands tallest. Tell Grey Dove I will act as the shadows lengthen, when attention focuses on their papers and agreements." Catherine pointed to a distant rock formation shaped like a broken fist. "If your people could create a disturbance there, perhaps fire or smoke, it would draw attention and concern." Sparrow nodded. "It will be done, and then I make use of their distraction." Catherine's eyes tracked to where Thunder still resisted Blackwell's attempts to subdue him. The stallion reared and pulled away, evading the quirt with intelligence that made her proud despite the dangerous situation. "They believe their strength lies in numbers and weapons," Catherine said quietly. "They forget that knowledge is the deadlier weapon." Sparrow rose to leave. Grey Dove said you would understand. She said also to remind you, the ghost does not fight the wind, she becomes it. As the young Apache woman slipped away, Catherine returned her attention to the camp. The meeting preparations continued below, oblivious to her presence or the plans forming in her mind. Blackwell had finally given up his attempts with Thunder for now, stalking away in visible frustration while the stallion paced his enclosure. By sundown, Catherine promised herself both Thunder and the boy would be free, and the carefully constructed criminal enterprise below would be facing justice it never expected, in the form of a legend they dismissed as mere frontier mythology. The sun climbed toward its zenith as activity intensified around the Forsaken Lady mine. Catherine observed from her concealed position as more dignitaries arrived, men in expensive suits escorted by hired guns, territorial officials with document cases, even a judge whose reputation for corrupt rulings was well known throughout Arizona. This was far beyond a simple criminal gathering. Blackwell had assembled the architects of a territorial power grab, using water rights as the foundation for control. Such schemes had happened before in the expanding West. Whoever controlled water controlled everything else, from cattle to mining to transportation. Catherine's attention shifted to a new arrival, a military wagon under escort by 4 uniformed cavalry troopers. From it emerged a stern-faced officer whose insignia marked him as a colonel. His presence suggested army involvement, or at least the appearance of it, lending legitimacy to whatever transactions would occur. "Quite the coalition you've built, Blackwell," Catherine murmured, noting how each group maintained subtle distance from the others. Hired guns separate from territorial officials, bankers avoiding direct interaction with known outlaws, military keeping formal distance from all parties. United in purpose, but divided by station and reputation, such divisions could be exploited. Catherine made her way carefully around the perimeter of the camp, using natural cover and moving only when guards' attention was directed elsewhere. Her immediate goal was to reach the small stream that supplied the camp, which ran behind the kitchen tent where Ruth worked. If the Apache sleeping herbs were to be effective, they needed to enter the food or water supply before the midday meal. As she approached, Catherine spotted Ruth alone at the stream, filling water buckets. The opportunity was perfect. Almost. Too perfect. Catherine hesitated, scanning for any sign of observation or trap. Seeing none, she slipped silently down to the water's edge. "Ruth," she whispered. The woman started, nearly dropping her bucket. "Saints preserve us. How did you—" She lowered her voice. "They're all here. Important men from across the territory, signing papers that will ruin hundreds of settlers. I need your help," Catherine said, revealing the small clay bottle. "This needs to go into the coffee for the meeting. It won't harm anyone, just induce drowsiness and confusion. Can you do it?" Ruth's eyes widened, then hardened with determination. "After what they did to my Thomas, gladly." She took the bottle, concealing it in her apron pocket. "The boy is still in the foreman's quarters. They've been keeping him drugged. Easier to control that way. This is complicated matters. A drugged child would be harder to move quickly." "Is he able to walk?" "Barely. They give him less during the day so he can eat." Ruth glanced nervously toward the kitchen tent. "They'll be expecting me back. The meeting starts at noon, with a meal served after the main agreements are signed." "Perfect timing," Catherine said. "When do they check on Thunder?" "The scarred one, Blackwell. He's obsessed with breaking that horse. Goes himself every few hours. Plans to try again after the meeting, and says he needs the stallion complaint before they move him to their main operation near the territorial border." Catherine processed this information. "When the confusion starts, get to the boy if you can. There's an old mining trail behind the North Ridge. Head there. Apache allies will find you." Ruth nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else you Should know. The banker, Harrison, has papers showing foreclosure on your ranch. They're claiming legal ownership of everything you have, including Thunder. Cold anger flared in Catherine's chest. On what grounds? Some debt your husband supposedly took before he died. The documents look legitimate. Territorial seal and everything. Forgeries, Catherine said flatly. James left no debts. This is Blackwell creating a legal cover for theft. Ruth looked over her shoulder anxiously. I should go. They'll be suspicious. She started to rise, then added, one more thing. They've posted extra guards for the meeting. Some of Blackwell's best men are positioned as lookouts on the surrounding ridges. This was concerning news. Catherine had counted on most attention being focused on the meeting itself. How many? Where? 3 that I know of. North Ridge, East Approach, and overlooking the main trail. Ruth gathered her water buckets. Be careful, these men, they're not just outlaws. They truly believe they're building something that will make them the new power in the territory. As Ruth returned to the kitchen tent, Catherine retreated to higher ground. The additional lookouts complicated her plan, but didn't derail it. Years of tracking had taught her that overconfidence was often the downfall of otherwise careful men. The lookouts would be watching for obvious threats, poses, lawmen, rival gangs. Not a single woman moving like a ghost across terrain she knew better than they ever could. Catherine circled toward the North Ridge, where the first lookout was, positioned. Through her field glasses, she studied him, a professional gunman judging by his gear and positioning, rifle resting on a natural rock formation that gave him clear sightlines to all approaches. What he didn't have was protection. From above, using natural handholds in the rocky slope, Catherine climbed silently up the backside of the ridge. The Apache had taught her to test each hold before committing her weight, to blend her silhouette with natural formations, to time movements with gusts of wind that would mask any sound of displaced stones. The lookout never sensed her presence, until Catherine's knife was at his throat. Not a sound, she whispered, as his body went rigid with shock. I have no desire to kill you unless forced. The man remained perfectly still, professional enough to recognize his disadvantage. Catherine relieved him of his weapons with practiced efficiency. Who are you? He managed, voice barely audible. Someone who wants her horse back. Catherine used strips torn from the man's own bandana to secure his hands and feet, then gagged him with the remainder. Your employers stole from the wrong woman. Using the lookout's own rope, she secured him to a boulder, positioned where he wouldn't be visible from below, but also wouldn't suffer exposure to the harsh sun. Killing unnecessarily had never been Ghost Feet's way, even in her bounty hunting days. Taking the man's field glasses, Catherine surveyed the camp from her new vantage point. The meeting was gathering in the main building. Important men taking seats around a large table spread with maps and documents. Blackwell himself stood at the head, his scarred face animated as he addressed the assembly. Though she couldn't hear his words, his gestures indicated grand plans and promises of prosperity. Catherine's gaze shifted to the corral where Thunder was kept. The stallion remained separate from other horses, still unbroken despite Blackwell's earlier attempts. Even from this distance, she could see the proud arch of his neck, the defiant posture that had made him so valuable as breeding stock for her small ranch. The foreman's quarters where Matthew was held had a single guard now, a man who repeatedly checked his timepiece, eager for the meeting to conclude, Catherine surmised, so he could join the celebration that would undoubtedly follow. Through the field glasses she spotted Ruth in the kitchen tent, directing other captive women in meal preparation. The woman's expression revealed nothing as she moved between cook fires and water barrels, but Catherine noted how she lingered slightly longer at the large coffee pot destined for the meeting room. Everything was aligning. The Apache herbs would take effect slowly, creating confusion rather than obvious symptoms. By the time the territorial officials realized something was wrong, Catherine would be moving on the second phase of her plan. She checked the position of the sun. Nearly noon. The meeting would be starting, and with it, the beginning of the end. For Blackwell's operation, Catherine allowed herself a rare smile. The gang leader had spent years building his criminal empire, assembling political allies, and creating the appearance of legitimacy. He'd never suspect that a widow, tracking her stolen horse, would be the catalyst for its destruction. The hunt that had begun with Thunder's theft was about to become something far more significant. Justice for an entire territory held hostage by corruption and greed. The midday sun beat down mercilessly as Catherine made her way toward the second lookout position on the eastern ridge. Using the field glasses she'd taken from the first guard, she studied her target carefully. Another professional. This one positioned with a clear view of both the camp and the main approach from the territorial road. Unlike the first lookout, this man maintained constant movement, changing position every few minutes. A disciplined veteran taking his job. Seriously, direct approach wouldn't work here. Catherine needed a different strategy. From her pouch, she retrieved the small wooden whistle Sparrow had provided. The Apache had long understood that what couldn't be accomplished through direct confrontation could often be achieved through misdirection. Catherine positioned herself carefully, out of the lookout's direct line of sight, but within range of a small herd of wild mustangs grazing in a protected valley beyond the ridge. When the guard's attention shifted toward the camp, she brought the whistle to her lips and blew. Though silent to human ears, the effect on the mustangs was immediate. The herd leader's head shot up, ears pricked forward. Catherine blew again, the special frequency triggering the horse's instinctive alarm response. Within moments, the entire herd was in motion, wheeling and running in apparent panic. The lookout's attention snapped to the sudden movement. Through her field glasses, Catherine watched his posture change as he focused on the fleeing horses, clearly trying to determine what had spooked them. Predators. Rival gang. His rifle shifted, tracking the direction of the Mustang's flight. Catherine used his distraction to close the distance, moving from cover to cover with the fluid grace that had earned her legendary status. When merely 20 yards separated them, she employed another Apache trick, a small stone thrown precisely to create noise in the opposite direction. The lookout spun toward the sound, providing Catherine the opening she needed. 3 swift strides brought her within range. And before the man could react, the butt of his own colleague's pistol struck precisely at the base of his skull. He crumpled without a sound. Catherine bound and gagged him as she had the first, positioning him out of the sun, but well concealed from any searching eyes. 2 lookouts neutralized, 1 remaining. As she prepared to move toward the third position, Catherine paused, noticing a change in the camp below. Men were emerging from the main building, their movements suggesting a recess in the meeting. Through the field glasses, she observed several of the territorial officials looking distinctly unwell, rubbing their temples, accepting water from concerned aides, loosening collars in the heat. The sleeping herbs were beginning to take effect. The banker, Harrison, appeared particularly affected, leaning heavily on a younger assistant as he made his way to a shaded area. Even Blackwell seemed to be fighting discomfort, though his iron discipline kept his posture rigid as he conferred with the corrupt deputy marshal. Catherine allowed herself brief satisfaction before turning her attention to the final lookout. This one would be the most challenging, positioned directly overlooking the main trail with minimal cover for approach. But the growing confusion in the camp might provide the opportunity she needed. As she studied the situation, a flash of movement caught her attention. Ruth, hurrying from the kitchen tent toward the foreman's quarters with a covered tray. The meeting's disruption had created an opportunity for her to check on the boy. Through the field glasses, Catherine watched Ruth speak briefly with the guard, who waved her through with minimal interest. The man's posture suggested he too was experiencing effects from the herbs, perhaps from a shared water barrel or earlier cup of coffee. The growing disorder was spreading faster than anticipated. Catherine needed to accelerate her timeline. A sharp whistle from distant rocks signaled that Sparrow's people were in position. The Apache would create their diversion when the sun touched a particular peak, perhaps 20 minutes from now. Catherine needed to neutralize the final lookout and be ready to move when that happened. She circled wide, approaching the lookout's position from behind and below, the direction least likely to be monitored. The terrain here was challenging, loose shale threatening to announce her presence with every step. Catherine moved with exaggerated care, testing each placement before committing her weight. When she was within 30 yards, disaster nearly struck. A startled jackrabbit burst from cover, freezing both Catherine and the lookout in momentary tableau. The man's rifle swung toward the disturbance, then tracked further as instinct warned him the rabbit itself wasn't the threat. Catherine remained absolutely motionless, her dun-colored clothing blending with the rocky terrain. The Apache had taught her that the human eye was drawn to movement more than shape or color. Even when looking directly at a stationary object, predator vision often failed to distinguish it from the background. Long seconds passed. The lookout's rifle barrel wavered, then gradually lowered as he dismissed the disturbance as wildlife. Catherine released a silent breath and resumed her careful approach. She was within striking distance when commotion erupted in the camp below. Through gaps in the rocks, she glimpsed men rushing from the main building, several doubled over in obvious distress. The herbs had taken full effect, striking some harder than others, depending on how much coffee they'd consumed. The lookout's attention fixed completely on the chaos below, giving Catherine her opening. This time she opted for a silent approach rather than confrontation, slipping behind the man and pressing the blade of her hunting knife against his kidney. "Don't move," she whispered. "My quarrel isn't with you unless you make it so." The man stiffened, but had the wisdom not to resist. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "Do you have any idea who's down there?" "Corrupt officials, outlaws and thieves," Catherine replied, relieving him of his weapons. "Planning to steal water rights from honest settlers." Something in the man's posture changed. "You don't understand the situation." "I understand enough." Catherine used the man's own bandana to bind his hands. "Blackwell stole my horse and kidnapped a child to manipulate his father." The lookout went very still. "What child?" "The marshal's son from Copper Springs, Matthew." A tremor ran through the man's body that had nothing to do with fear. "How old?" 10, Catherine answered, suddenly wary of his reaction. "Blonde hair, blue eyes, small for his age." Catherine's knife pressed harder. "Who are you?" The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "Henry Wilson, U.S. Marshal Service. I've been undercover in Blackwell's operation for 3 months." Catherine's mind raced. A federal agent embedded this deeply would explain the man's professional bearing and distinctive tactics, but trusting him would be dangerous if he was lying. "The boy," Wilson continued urgently. "He's my nephew, my sister's son. I've been trying to locate him since they took him, but they've kept his location secret, even from most of the gang." "Convenient claim," Catherine said, though doubt had crept into her certainty. "Inside the pocket of my vest," Wilson said, "marshals, a badge and documentation. Letter from my sister with Matthew's description." Keeping the knife steady, Catherine checked with her free hand. The badge was genuine. She'd seen enough to know the difference between territorial and federal issues. The letter, tear-stained and worn from repeated handling, matched the man's story. "If you're telling the truth," she said, "why are you looking outward instead of watching the camp?" "Because I signaled my backup before the meeting. 10 federal marshals are positioned beyond that ridge, waiting for my confirmation that all the targets are gathered." Wilson nodded toward a distant formation. "I was watching for their approach, not potential interference. This changed everything." If federal forces were already in position, Catherine's plan could dovetail with theirs or interfere catastrophically. "The herbs," she said. "They're non-lethal, but half the men in that meeting won't be fit for arrest within the hour." Wilson's expression shifted between alarm and reluctant admiration. "That explains the sudden illness. What are you doing?" "With help." Catherine made a decision and cut his bonds. "We have perhaps 20 minutes before my Apache allies create a diversion. On the North Ridge, I plan to use the confusion to free Thunder and the boy." "The Apaches are with you?" Wilson's professional assessment was visible in his eyes. "That changes the tactical situation significantly." He retrieved his weapons as Catherine permitted, but made no threatening moves. "My men are waiting for a specific signal. Once given, they'll move in from multiple directions, but that won't happen for another hour." Catherine considered their options. "The situation in the camp is deteriorating faster than expected. Ruth, one of the women they've forced to work for them, is with Matthew now. Blackwell and his core men aren't as affected by the herbs as the officials." Wilson nodded grimly. "Because they wouldn't be drinking with the territories, too cautious." He checked his timepiece. "If your diversion happens in 20 minutes and we can get Matthew and your horse clear before then your operation can proceed as planned," Catherine finished, "without risk to the innocent." For the first time, a hint of a smile touched Wilson's face. "I've heard stories about ghost feet. Never thought I'd be making common cause with a legend." "Save the flattery for when the boy is safe," Catherine replied, already focusing on their next moves. "We need to coordinate precisely if this is going to work." The situation in the camp deteriorated rapidly as Catherine and Wilson observed from their elevated position. Through field glasses, they watched several territorial officials being helped to wagons, clearly too ill to continue the meeting. The banker Harrison appeared particularly afflicted, barely conscious, as his aides carried him to his carriage. "The herbs work faster than I expected," Catherine murmured. "Fortunate for us," Wilson replied, his professional assessment evident. As he surveyed the growing chaos, Blackwell's inner circle seems largely unaffected. Indeed, Ezra Blackwell stood rigid with fury at the entrance to the main building, conferring intensely with the corrupt Deputy Marshal Davis and 3 of his most trusted men. Their gestures suggested suspicion rather than illness. "They're not drinking the coffee," Catherine observed. "They suspect something." Wilson nodded grimly. "Davis is too cautious to consume anything in mixed company. They'll be looking for sabotage." He checked his timepiece. "We have 18 minutes before your Apache diversion. What exactly should we expect?" "Smoke signals from the North Ridge. Possibly controlled brush fires to draw attention. Nothing that would endanger the camp directly, but enough to split Blackwell's forces." Catherine focused on the foreman's quarters, where Ruth had not yet emerged. "I'm more concerned about the boy and Ruth now, if Blackwell suspects interference." The words had barely left her mouth when a commotion erupted near the foreman's quarters. The guard who had admitted Ruth earlier now dragged her roughly into the open, shouting for Blackwell. Even at this distance, Catherine could see blood on Ruth's face from what appeared to be a vicious strike. "They've discovered her," Wilson said tensely, raising his field glasses. "The boy?" Catherine shifted her focus to the building's entrance, where a second guard emerged with Matthew. The child seemed barely conscious, limbs uncoordinated, still affected by whatever drugs they'd been giving him. "We need to move now," she said, rising into a crouch. "The plan's compromised." Wilson's hand on her arm restrained her. "Wait. Rushing in against those odds is suicide, even for ghost feet." Below, Blackwell stormed across the compound toward Ruth, his scarred face contorted with rage. The assembled gang members formed a rough circle as he confronted the woman, who, despite her obvious fear, stood defiant. Though too distant to hear the exchange, Catherine read the body language clearly. Accusation, Denial, escalating threat. When Blackwell struck Ruth hard enough to send her sprawling into the dust, Catherine's muscles tensed involuntarily. "I can't wait while he beats an innocent woman," she said, shrugging off Wilson's restraining hand. "You won't help her by dying," Wilson countered urgently. "Look at the broader situation." Catherine forced herself to assess the entire camp rather than focus solely on Ruth's plight. What she saw gave her pause. The chaos had created unexpected patterns of movement throughout the compound. Most of Blackwell's men were now concentrated near the confrontation, leaving other areas, specifically the corral where Thunder was, kept with minimal supervision. Meanwhile, several of the territorial officials' wagons were already departing, their drivers eager to get their ailing masters away from what they likely perceived as some form of poisoning. This exodus was creating congestion on the main trail, blocking the planned escape route for some of Blackwell's forces. Most significant, the corrupt Deputy Marshal Davis was nowhere to be seen, having apparently slipped away during the confusion. "Davis is making a run for it," Wilson observed, confirming Catherine's assessment. "Rats deserting a sinking ship." The situation was evolving by the second. Ruth was now being restrained by two gang members, while Blackwell questioned her with increasing brutality. The boy, Matthew, had been handed off to a single guard who seemed uncertain where to take him in the midst of the chaos. "There," Catherine pointed, seeing their opportunity. "The guard with Matthew is isolated, moving toward the storage shed, and only one man is watching Thunder now." Wilson nodded, his tactical assessment aligning with hers. "We can time this with your Apache diversion, but we need to move into position now." They descended swiftly from the ridge, using natural cover and the distraction of the central confrontation, to approach the camp's perimeter undetected. Crouching behind abandoned mining equipment, they were close enough now to hear Blackwell's interrogation of Ruth. "Who helped you, woman?" he demanded, voice tight with controlled fury. "No settlers. Wife could have acquired such potent herbs." "Was it the widow? Is she here?" Ruth's laugh was defiant despite her bloodied face. "You're a fool, Ezra Blackwell. You steal from a legend and expect no consequences?" The scarred leader struck her again. "Ghost feet is a campfire story to frighten children, nothing more." "Then why do you look over your shoulder when the wind changes?" Ruth taunted. "Why post triple lookouts if you fear no pursuit?" Catherine signaled to Wilson, pointing toward the storage shed where the guard had taken Matthew. "The boy first," she whispered. "Then I'll get Thunder." Wilson shook his head. "Together for both. I'll not leave you without backup in this Viper's nest." Before Catherine could argue, a sharp cry of alarm came from the north ridge. One of Blackwell's men was pointing urgently at three distinct columns of smoke now rising into the azure sky. "Apache signals!" someone shouted, triggering immediate panic among many of the gang members, particularly those familiar with Frontier. "Warfare! Steady!" Blackwell roared, but his authority was already fracturing as men rushed for weapons or horses. This was the diversion they'd been waiting for. As Blackwell's attention fixed on the distant smoke columns, Catherine and Wilson moved swiftly toward the storage shed. The guard stationed there was nervously watching the smoke rather than his prisoner, his rifle held carelessly as he craned his neck for a better view. Wilson took him with practiced efficiency, a swift blow to the base of the skull that rendered him unconscious without noise. Catherine was already inside the shed, finding Matthew huddled in a corner, eyes wide with fear. "We're friends of your father," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "Your Uncle Henry is here to take you home." The boy's recognition of Wilson was immediate and profound. Despite his drugged state, he lunged into his uncle's arms with a strangled sob. "Can you walk?" Wilson asked urgently, checking the boy for injuries. "Think so," Matthew slurred, struggling to coordinate his movements. "I'll carry him," Wilson decided, lifting the small body effortlessly. "Thunder next?" Catherine nodded, leading the way back into the open air. The camp had descended into near chaos now, with men rushing in multiple directions, some preparing defenses against possible Apache attack, others clearly considering desertion as the situation deteriorated. Through the confusion, Catherine spotted Ruth still held by one guard, the other having been called away to help form a defensive line. Making a split-second decision, she changed course, approaching from the guard's blind side. The man never saw the blow coming, a precise strike to the nerve cluster at the base of his neck that dropped him instantly. Ruth staggered free, her face a mask of bruises but her eyes clear with determination. "The others?" Catherine asked tersely, referring to the other captive women. "Already fled when the confusion started," Ruth confirmed. "North Trail, like you said." Wilson adjusted Matthew's weight in his arms. "We need to move. Blackwell will re-establish control quickly. He's too experienced not to." Catherine nodded toward the corral where Thunder was kept. One more essential task. Thunder's guard was already abandoning his post, drawn by Blackwell's shouted orders to form a defensive perimeter. The magnificent black stallion paced his enclosure restlessly, sensing the chaos and opportunity it presented. As they approached, the horse's ears pricked forward, recognizing Catherine immediately. He nickered softly, pressing against the rough-hewn gate. "Hello, old friend," Catherine whispered, working the simple latch mechanism. "Time to go home." The moment the gate swung open, Thunder pushed through, circling Catherine once in evident joy before standing perfectly positioned for her to mount. Despite the urgency of their situation, Wilson couldn't suppress a look of amazement. "I've never seen a horse respond like that," he admitted. "Like he understands everything." "He does," Catherine said simply, swinging onto Thunder's bare back with practiced ease. She extended a hand to Ruth. "Can you ride double?" The battered woman nodded, accepting Catherine's help up behind her on the stallion's broad back. Wilson, still carrying Matthew, glanced toward the western edge of the camp. "My men will be waiting beyond those rocks," he said, indicating a formation in the distance. "If we can reach them, we'll have armed backup." "There they are!" The shout cut through the chaos as one of Blackwell's men spotted the escaping group. "The horse! They're taking the stallion!" Catherine felt Thunder tense beneath her, the stallion understanding the danger as clearly as his human riders. "Go," she urged Wilson. "We'll draw their attention." The federal marshal hesitated, visibly torn between his duty to protect his nephew and his reluctance to leave Catherine and Ruth facing the brunt of pursuit. "Your men are waiting," Catherine reminded him sharply. "Get Matthew to safety. We'll circle around and meet you." A gunshot cracked through the air, the bullet kicking up dust near Thunder's hooves. Decision made for him, Wilson nodded grimly and sprinted toward the western rocks, clutching his nephew close to his chest. Catherine leaned forward over Thunder's neck. "Show them why they couldn't break you," she whispered. The stallion needed no further encouragement, leaping forward with explosive power that nearly unseated Ruth. Instead of heading directly after Wilson, Catherine guided Thunder in a wide arc through the camp's eastern edge, deliberately drawing pursuit away from the marshal and his vulnerable charge. The strategy worked immediately. 6 riders mounted hastily, focusing entirely on the magnificent black stallion and its riders. "Hang on," Catherine called over her shoulder to Ruth, who clutched desperately at her waist as Thunder accelerated to a full gallop. Despite carrying double, the stallion's legendary speed quickly opened distance between them and their pursuers. Blackwell's voice rose above the commotion, his fury evident even at a distance. $500 to whoever brings me that horse. Double for the women alive." The bounty energized the pursuit, more men rushing for mounts. Catherine guided Thunder toward a narrow ravine that cut through the foothills east of the mine. "Eyes us, a challenging route that would favor local knowledge over numbers. They'll cut us off at Cougar Pass," Ruth warned, her voice strained from the punishing pace. "It's the only way through the ravine." "Not the only way," Catherine countered, directing, thunder toward what appeared to be a solid rock wall. At the last possible moment, she guided him into a nearly invisible gap between towering boulders, a hidden trail known only to local Apache and those they trusted. The passage was barely wide enough for the horse, forcing both women to pull, their legs up tight against Thunder's flanks. Behind them, shouts of confusion and anger marked the moment their pursuers lost visual contact. The hidden trail wound upward through increasingly rocky terrain, unsuitable for the direct pursuit of multiple riders. Catherine knew this would split Blackwell's forces, some following directly, others circling to cut them off, where the trail eventually rejoined more open ground. "Where are we going?" Ruth gasped, as Thunder navigated the treacherous path with surprising confidence, his footing sure despite the loose shale and narrow passages. "Circle north, then west," Catherine explained, constantly scanning for signs of pursuit. "Wilson's men will be at Broken Finger Rocks. If we can reach them before Blackwell regroups—" A rifle shot echoed through the ravine, the bullet whining. Off stone, well above their heads. Looking back, Catherine spotted two riders who had found the hidden trail entrance, their mounts struggling with the difficult terrain, but still advancing. "They're persistent," she muttered, urging Thunder to greater speed where the trail briefly widened. Ruth's fingers dug painfully into Catherine's sides as the stallion leapt a narrow fissure in the path. "Blackwell won't give up," she said between labored breaths. "Not on your horse and not on us. We know too much." "Let him come," Catherine replied, her focus narrowing to the immediate challenges of terrain and pursuit. The Apache had taught her that fear was natural, but useless unless transformed into heightened awareness. The trail crested a rocky ridge before descending sharply on the far side. Catherine reined Thunder to a momentary halt, surveying the valley. Below, dust clouds marked the movement of riders, Blackwell's men circling to intercept them, at least 8 moving fast. "They've split up to cut us off," Ruth observed, her voice steadier now despite her injuries. Catherine nodded, making quick calculations. The direct route to Broken Finger Rocks was clearly watched. They needed an alternative. As if responding to her thoughts, a distant whistle carried on the wind, 3 short notes followed by 1 long. The Apache signal for danger ahead, warning friends to change course. "Your people are still watching," Ruth said with wonder. "They've always watched these mountains," Catherine replied, scanning the ridgelines until she spotted a barely visible figure on a distant outcropping. The figure raised an arm, pointing northwest before disappearing from view. Catherine immediately understood. "Hold tight," she instructed Ruth, turning Thunder toward a seemingly impassable cliff face. The stallion balked momentarily before Catherine's gentle insistence convinced him to trust her judgment. What appeared solid from a distance revealed itself as another hidden trail, this one even narrower and steeper, switching back on itself repeatedly as it descended into a canyon not visible from their previous position. "Lightning Canyon," Ruth whispered, recognition and fear mingling in her voice. "The flood path." The canyon was notorious among locals, a deadly channel when sudden storms sent walls of water cascading through its narrow confines. Even now, in dry weather, the evidence of past floods was visible in debris caught high on the rock walls and the smooth, scoured stone beneath Thunder's hooves. "No one will follow us here," Catherine confirmed. "Too dangerous for those who don't know it intimately." The canyon wound like a serpent through the mountains, its high walls blocking direct sunlight and muffling distant sounds of pursuit. Thunder moved with careful precision, his trust in Catherine evident with every step. After 15 minutes of tense progress, the canyon began to widen, its western wall gradually lowering until they could see across the broader landscape. In the distance, Broken Finger Rocks stood sentinel against the sky, named for their distinctive formation resembling a hand with shattered digits. "I see riders," Ruth reported, straining to make out details. At least a dozen near the rocks. Catherine nodded, her keen eyes confirming Ruth's count. Wilson's men, based on their positioning, defensive formation, not pursuit grouping. The canyon soon opened into a broad wash, allowing Thunder to resume at a faster pace. They were still several miles from the rocks, crossing exposed terrain that left them vulnerable to observation from multiple vantage points. The sudden crack of rifles confirmed Catherine's concerns. 3 riders had emerged from a side canyon to their right, cutting loose with long-range fire more intended to slow than to hit at such distance. "Hang on!" Catherine called, urging Thunder to his full gallop. The stallion responded magnificently, stretching out across the rough terrain with ground-devouring strides that no ordinary horse could match. The pursuing riders fell behind rapidly, but more appeared ahead, a group of 5 emerging from behind a low rise, forming a line to block their path to the rocks. "We're caught between them," Ruth cried, her momentary optimism fading. Catherine assessed their options with the cold clarity that had made her legendary. Direct confrontation against armed men would be suicidal. Turning back would mean facing the 3 pursuers behind them. The only remaining choice was to break through the line ahead, a desperate gamble with poor odds. As she weighed these grim alternatives, movement on their left flank caught her attention. Riders approaching fast. But they moved differently, with the fluid grace of horsemen who seemed part of their mounts rather than separate entities. "Apache," Catherine realized aloud, recognizing the distinctive riding style of her adoptive people. 5 warriors, faces painted for battle, curved toward their position from the northern hills. The lead rider, a young man Catherine recognized as Grey Dove's grandson, made the sign for follow before changing course to intercept the Blackwell men ahead. "What are they doing?" Ruth asked, confusion evident in her voice. "Creating an opening," Catherine explained, adjusting Thunder's direction to follow the Apache lead. "They won't directly engage unless forced, too risky for the tribe. But they can disrupt, distract, divide." The strategy became clear as the Apache riders charged directly toward Blackwell's blocking line, their sudden appearance from unexpected quarters causing momentary confusion. At the last possible moment, the warriors split into 2 groups, circling the outlaws in a classic harassment pattern. No shots were fired. The Apache were careful to stay out of effective range while creating maximum disruption. The tactic worked perfectly, pulling the outlaws out of position as they tried to respond to threats from multiple directions. "Now!" Catherine urged, driving Thunder straight toward the gap that had opened in the blockade. The stallion sensed the critical moment, gathering himself for a burst of speed that seemed impossible after the grueling chase. They flashed through the broken line before Blackwell's men could reorganize, hoofbeats thundering across the hard-packed earth as they raced toward the distant rocks where Wilson's federal forces waited. Behind them, frustrated shouts and scattered gunfire marked the outlaws' realization that their quarry had slipped through. The Apache riders were already disappearing into the landscape, their diversionary mission accomplished without a single shot fired in return. "We might make it," Ruth breathed, hoping to return to her voice as they closed the distance to broken finger rocks. Catherine remained focused, knowing the danger was far from past. "Blackwell himself is still out there," she warned, "and he won't give up easily." As if summoned by her words, a lone rider appeared on a rise to their right. 2. Distant to identify visually, but Catherine felt a chill of recognition nonetheless. The figure sat motionless, watching their flight toward federal protection. Ezra Blackwell had joined the hunt personally. The lone figure on the rise remained motionless as Catherine drove Thunder toward the federal position at Broken Finger Rocks. Though too distant to make out facial features, the rigid posture and distinctive silhouette left no doubt Ezra Blackwell was watching, calculating, planning. "Why isn't he pursuing?" Ruth asked, nervously glancing back as they put more distance between themselves and the solitary rider. Because he's smarter than his men, Catherine replied grimly. He knows Thunder can outrun anything in the territory. In a straight chase, he's looking for another angle. The realization hit her with sudden clarity. He's going to cut around to intercept us before we reach the marshals. Catherine studied the terrain ahead, mentally mapping the fastest routes. If Blackwell took the game trail through Sidewinder Pass, he could potentially reach the western approach to Broken Finger Rocks before they did. The direct route would bring Catherine and Ruth to the rocks from the south, where open ground made them vulnerable to ambush. We need to change course, she decided, guiding Thunder northward toward rougher terrain. Take the high approach instead. Ruth tightened her grip as the stallion responded to Catherine's guidance, shifting direction to tackle a steeper, rockier ascent. Won't that slow us down? Yes, but it'll force Blackwell to choose. Either follow us into territory where Thunder has the advantage, or stick to his original plan and risk missing us entirely. The strategy required perfect timing. Too slow, and Blackwell could adjust his course to intercept them along the new route. Too fast, and they might run headlong into any outlaws still positioned between them and the federal forces. Thunder attacked the slope with determined strength, his powerful hindquarters driving upward despite the fatigue of carrying double for miles across challenging terrain. Catherine felt a moment of fierce pride in the stallion's heart and intelligence. No ordinary horse would have endured what he had since his theft, still performing with such extraordinary capability. When they created the slope, Catherine reined Thunder to a brief halt, surveying the landscape. From this elevated position, she could see Wilson's men at Broken Finger Rocks, their defensive formation visible even at this distance. More importantly, she spotted movement to the west. Blackwell had indeed taken Sidewinder Pass, riding hard to position himself before they could reach safety. He's alone, Catherine observed, her eyes narrowing. Where are the rest of his men? Ruth scanned the terrain. There, to the east, at least 5 riders circled to cut us off from behind. And 3 more approaching from the south, Catherine added, pointing to dust clouds visible against the lowering afternoon sun. They're trying to form a net. The moment of observation had cost precious seconds. Catherine urged Thunder forward again, angling northeastward along the ridgeline. This route would add distance, but offered better visibility and fewer places for ambush. The marshals have spotted us, Ruth reported, seeing movement among the federal group ahead. Indeed, several riders had broken from the main formation, moving to provide cover for their approach. Wilson was likely among them, having delivered Matthew to safety, and now returning to assist their escape. Thunder's pace remained strong despite his exertion, the stallion somehow sensing the importance of reaching those distant figures. The ridge narrowed as they progressed, eventually becoming a natural bridge of stone, connecting 2 higher formations. This passage offered the advantage of protection from gunfire on either side, but created a potential bottleneck if blocked. Catherine's instincts prickled as they approached the narrowest section. Something felt wrong, the positioning of Blackwell's scattered forces, the absence of pursuit directly behind them. The outlaw leader was too experienced to waste manpower on obviously failed approaches. She reined Thunder to a sudden stop just short of the stone bridge, scanning the terrain with heightened awareness. Nothing moved, nothing seemed out of place, yet her intuition screamed warning. Then she saw it, the barest glint of sunlight on metal from a crevice near the far end of the bridge. Someone lay hidden there, waiting. Ambush, she whispered, immediately backing Thunder away from the exposed position. How did he get ahead of us? Ruth asked, her voice taut with renewed fear. He didn't. It's not Blackwell. Catherine studied the position, noting the perfect field of fire it offered. One of his best men, stationed there earlier as fallback protection for their meeting. We just happened to choose the same escape route. This complicated matters significantly. the hidden. Gunmen could hold the position indefinitely, effectively blocking their most direct path to safety. Attempting to cross the stone bridge would make them perfect targets. "Could we go around?" Ruth suggested, looking for alternative routes. Catherine assessed the options rapidly. Going back would mean facing the riders, closing from behind. Descending to either side would slow them dramatically while exposing them to fire from multiple directions. Forward was the only viable choice, but the bridge seemed impassable with the gunmen in position. A distant whistle drew Catherine's attention. One of Wilson's marshals, signaling that they'd spotted the ambush as well. She responded with a quick wave, acknowledging their awareness of the situation. As if triggered by this exchange, a rifle shot cracked from the hidden position, the bullet whining harmlessly overhead. A warning rather than a serious attempt to hit them at this range. "He's getting nervous," Catherine observed, "wants us to retreat toward the others." The tactical problem seemed insoluble until Catherine noticed Thunder's ears flicking rhythmically toward the north. Following his focus, she spotted movement. Among the rocks above and beyond the bridge, subtle shifts that most would miss entirely. Apache, moving into position with their characteristic stealth. Understanding bloomed in Catherine's mind. Grey Dove's people weren't just providing diversions, they were actively clearing their escape route. The hidden gunman was about to receive an unwelcome surprise. "Be ready," she told Ruth quietly. "When I say now, hold tight and don't look back." The seconds stretched as Catherine waited for the perfect moment. Another shot from the hidden gunman, this one closer, but still meant to intimidate rather than eliminate. He was growing more anxious as the marshals gradually approached from the other direction. Then it happened. A small cascade of pebbles from above the gunman's position, deliberately triggered by unseen hands. The hidden figure's attention inevitably shifted upward for a critical second. "Now!" Catherine urged Thunder forward, the stallion launching into full gallop with explosive power. They thundered onto the stone bridge, hooves striking sparks from the rocky surface as they charged directly toward the hidden threat. The ambusher recovered quickly, swinging his rifle back toward the approaching riders. But before he could fire, a small object arced down from the rocks above. An Apache hunting bowler that wrapped around the rifle barrel with devastating accuracy, spoiling his aim as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wild as Catherine and Ruth flashed past the disrupted ambush position. A brief glimpse revealed the gunman struggling with both the entangled weapon and an apparent decision about whether to draw his sidearm or retreat from the unseen threat above. He chose retreat, scrambling backward from his position just as more. Stones clattered down from the heights, the Apache making their presence felt without directly engaging. Once across the bridge, Catherine guided Thunder onto a broader trail, leading directly toward the approaching marshals. The distance closed rapidly, federal badges now visible on the chests of the men riding to intercept them. "We're going to make it," Ruth breathed, her death grip on Catherine's waist finally relaxing slightly. Catherine remained vigilant, scanning for further threats. Not safe yet. Blackwell's still out there. As if summoned by her words, a lone rider appeared on a perpendicular trail ahead. Ezra Blackwell himself, positioned to make one final attempt at interception before they reached federal protection. Taz, scarred outlaw leader, sat his mount with cold determination, rifle raised but not yet firing, waiting for them to reach optimal range. The cruel calculation was clear. He preferred recapturing them, but would kill rather than lose them to the marshals. "Magnificent," Ruth whispered, genuine awe in her voice, as Thunder carried them to safety with his own intelligence and courage. The federal marshals spread out in a covering formation as Catherine and Thunder crossed the final stretch of open ground. Blackwell, recognizing the futility of continued pursuit against mounting odds, wheeled his horse around and galloped away toward distant hills. Wilson himself rode at the front of the marshal contingent, his face breaking into a relieved smile as they finally reached federal protection. "I was beginning to think you'd decided to handle Blackwell's entire gang by yourself," he called as they slowed to join the marshals. Catherine allowed herself the briefest smile in return. "The thought crossed my mind." Thunder stood steaming. In the afternoon heat, his black coat glistening with sweat, but his head held high despite the ordeal he'd endured. Wilson had guided the group to a defensible position among the Broken Finger rocks, where 12 federal marshals maintained a vigilant perimeter against potential pursuit. Catherine dismounted with less than her usual grace, the exhaustion of the past days finally catching up to her. Ruth needed assistance from 2 marshals, her injuries and fatigue making independent movement difficult. "Matthew?" Catherine asked immediately, scanning the gathered men. "Safe," Wilson assured her, gesturing toward a natural alcove where the boy rested on a bedroll, wrapped in a marshal's coat. "Doctors already checked him. The drugs they gave him are wearing off. He'll make a full recovery." Relief washed through. "Catherine, one innocent life secured, at least. The other women Ruth mentioned? We found them on the North Trail, just as you predicted." Wilson's expression held genuine admiration. "Already sent them to Copper Springs with an escort. They'll be safe there until they can be reunited with any surviving family." Catherine nodded, giving Thunder a grateful pat as a marshal brought water for the exhausted stallion. "What about Blackwell and his operation?" Wilson's face hardened. "That's our next order of business. We've been building a case against him for months, but today's gathering gave us everything we needed. Territorial officials accepting bribes, bankers involved in land fraud, military supplies being diverted, all documented by our agents." He gestured to a marshal unpacking field glasses and ammunition. "Jackson here has been undercover as one of Blackwell's hired guns for nearly 6 months, gathering evidence. Your disruption of their meeting was actually perfectly timed, created confusion, just as we were preparing to move in." "Speaking of which," Catherine said, "when exactly are you moving to the camp? Blackwell's men will be scattering now that they know something's wrong." "Already happening," Wilson replied with quiet satisfaction. "While I was bringing these men to secure your escape, the main force, 20 additional marshals, approached the Forsaken Lady from the south. They should be in position now." As if confirming his words, the distant crack of gunfire echoed across the landscape. Multiple shots followed, suggesting a significant confrontation underway. "Sounds like they've engaged," one of the marshals observed, checking his timepiece. "Right on schedule." Catherine's brow furrowed as she studied the distant dust clouds rising from the direction of the abandoned mine. "Blackwell won't be there," she said with certainty. "He was pursuing us personally, and when that failed, he headed northwest, away from the camp." Wilson nodded grimly. "I expected as much. He's too canny to be caught in a collapsing operation. Probably has escape caches and fresh horses staged across the territory." "You're not pursuing him?" Catherine asked, surprised. "Oh, we will," Wilson assured her. "But first we need to dismantle his organization completely, cut off his resources, his men, his political protection. A man like Blackwell can't operate alone. His power comes from the network he's built." Catherine understood the strategy. Isolate the predator from his pack before moving in for the final confrontation. The Apache used similar tactics when dealing with renegade warriors too dangerous to approach directly. Ruth approached, moving stiffly but with determination despite her injuries. A marshal had provided basic medical attention, cleaning the worst of her cuts and providing a canteen of fresh water. "The documents," she said without preamble. "The water rights contracts, land grants, banking records, they're the key to everything. If Blackwell escapes with those papers, he could restart elsewhere." Wilson's expression sharpened. "What documents specifically?" "In the main office building," Ruth explained. "A leather portfolio with the territorial seal. It contains falsified deeds, forged water rights, and banking authorizations with official signatures, some genuine, others forged. They were preparing to file them after today's meeting." Catherine's eyes met Wilson's, both recognizing the critical importance of these documents. "If your men don't know to look for them specifically," she warned, "they might be overlooked in the confusion." Wilson turned to his second-in-command. "Peterson, take 4 men and ride to reinforce the main group. Make sure they secure any and all documents in that camp, especially anything with official seals or signatures." The marshal nodded, immediately selecting men for the mission. As they prepared to depart, Catherine noticed a figure materializing from the rocks nearby, an Apache warrior moving with such natural stealth that even the trained marshals hadn't detected his approach. "Swifthawk," she acknowledged, recognizing Grey Dove's son. The other marshals tensed, hands moving toward weapons until Wilson signaled them to stand down. Swifthawk ignored the marshals, addressing Catherine directly in the Apache tongue. "The scarred man does not return to his camp. He rides north with 2 others, carrying saddlebags heavy with papers." Catherine translated for Wilson, whose expression darkened. "He's already secured the documents. Must have had them with him when he joined the pursuit." "Which direction exactly?" Catherine asked Swifthawk in Apache. "The northern trail toward Black Mesa," came the reply. "But they will circle east when they believe it is safe. 3 caches of fresh horses have been prepared along that route." When Catherine relayed this information, Wilson immediately began reorganizing his forces. "Peterson, change of plans. Take 6 men and cut across to intercept at Eagle Pass. It's the only viable route east from Black Mesa. The rest of us will pursue it directly to keep pressure on them." Peterson and his selected men departed immediately, riding hard to reach the pass before Blackwell could arrive. Wilson turned to Catherine, his expression serious. "You've done more than enough. You and Thunder should rest here while we handle the pursuit." Catherine shook her head. "Blackwell came to my ranch specifically. He knows who I am from our past encounter, and he took Thunder deliberately." She met Wilson's gaze steadily. "This isn't finished for me until he's brought to justice." Wilson studied her for a long moment, professional assessment mixing with growing respect. "The territory's stories about ghost feet didn't do you justice," he finally said, "but Thunder's exhausted from carrying double through that chase. Even a horse of his quality has limits." "I'll go alone," Catherine decided, checking her knife and the pistol Wilson had provided earlier. "On foot." Several of the marshals exchanged skeptical glances, but Swifthawk nodded with understanding. "The ghost walks faster than horses through the rocks," he said in Apache. "I will guide her on paths the white men cannot follow." Catherine turned to Ruth. "Stay with Matthew and the marshals. You'll be safe here." Ruth surprised her by stepping forward and grasping her hands. "My Thomas would still be alive if the law had stopped Blackwell sooner. Bring him to justice, Ghost Feet." Wilson clearly wanted to object, but recognized the determination in Catherine's expression. "At least take this," he said, offering a Winchester. Repeating rifle. "Swifthawk can lead you to intercept, but you shouldn't face Blackwell unarmed." Catherine accepted the weapon, checking its action with practiced ease. "We'll drive him toward your men at Eagle Pass. He won't escape justice this time." Swifthawk had already melted back into the rocks, preparing for their departure. Catherine knelt briefly beside Thunder, resting her forehead against his sweat-dampened neck. "Rest, old friend," she murmured. "You've earned it tenfold." The stallion nudged her gently, intelligent eyes seeming to understand the unfinished business that drew her away. One of the younger marshals had already begun tending to him, removing trail dust with careful hands and providing fresh water. Wilson organized the remaining marshals, preparing to pursue Blackwell along the main trails, while Catherine and Swifthawk took the hidden Apache routes. As they mounted up, he called to Catherine one last time. "The stories say ghost feet could outrun mounted men across the harshest terrain," he said, half questioning, half acknowledging. Catherine's smile was brief but genuine. "Guess we'll find out if the stories are true." As the marshals rode north in disciplined formation, Catherine turned to follow Swifthawk into the maze of rocks and hidden trails that would become their hunting ground. The Apache moved at a pace that would have exhausted ordinary travelers, but Catherine matched him stride for stride, her specially designed moccasin boots finding purchase on surfaces that seemed impossible to navigate. The hunt that had begun with Thunder's theft was approaching its conclusion. This time, the predator had become the prey. The desert landscape transformed around Catherine as she followed Swifthawk through passages invisible to untrained eyes. They moved relentlessly across terrain that would have stopped most travelers. Narrow ledges overlooking dizzying drops, near vertical rock faces requiring precise handholds, dry stream beds where loose shale threatened to betray each footstep. With noise, Swifthawk set a punishing pace, yet Catherine matched him stride for stride, her breathing controlled and movements fluid, despite the grueling nature of their route. The Apache warrior occasionally glanced back, approval evident in his otherwise stoic expression. "Grey Dove said you were one with the land," he remarked during a brief pause to drink from hidden water cached in a rock hollow. "She spoke the truth." Catherine accepted the compliment with a simple nod. The Apache did not give praise lightly, especially to those outside their tribe. That she had earned it reflected both her physical abilities and her respect for their ways. "Blackwell knows these territories well," she observed, scanning the vast landscape spreading below their elevated position. "But he doesn't know the old paths." Swifthawk made a gesture of agreement. "The white man sees the land as something to use, to own with paper marks. He does not listen to what it tells him." He pointed to distant dust clouds moving along a ridgeline. "There, the scarred one and his men. They ride hard, but must follow trails their horses can travel." Catherine studied the movement through a gap in the rocks. 3 riders, as Swifthawk had reported earlier, pushed their mounts at a pace that would eventually wear the animals down. From their position, she could see what Blackwell could not: the federal marshals following about 2 miles behind, and the landscape ahead that would eventually funnel them toward Eagle Pass. "How much time will the ancient paths give us?" she asked, calculating distances and terrain. "We will reach the ancestor stones before sundown," Swifthawk replied, referencing a distinctive rock formation that overlooked Eagle Pass from the south. "The riders will not arrive until dawn tomorrow's dawn, if their horses hold." Catherine nodded, mentally mapping their route. The ancient paths, trails used by the Apache and their ancestors for countless generations, cut directly through the landscape rather than following the contours that horsemen required. Some sections could be navigated only on foot, often requiring climbing skills and intimate knowledge of handholds worn into the rock over centuries of use. They resumed their relentless pace, moving with the rhythm of the land itself. Catherine felt the familiar focus settling over her, the state of heightened awareness where every sense sharpened, every movement became precise, and time itself seemed to flow differently. This was the mindset that had earned her the name Ghost Feet, the ability to cover vast distances across impossible terrain at speeds that mounted men could not match. As they traveled, Swifthawk shared information gathered by Apache scouts about Blackwell's organization and its recent collapse. "Your medicine in their food worked strong magic," he said with subtle humor. "The important men with paper marks became very sick. Some had to be carried to their wagons." "And the federal marshals?" Catherine asked, easily keeping pace as they traversed a narrow ledge overlooking a 100-foot drop. "They take many prisoners. The men who serve the scarred one fight at first, then surrender when they see they cannot win." Swifthawk navigated a particularly challenging section, his movements demonstrating generations of inherited knowledge. Your friend with the badge leads well. No killing unless necessary. This matched Wilson's professional approach. The federal marshal clearly valued justice over vengeance, proper procedure over expedience. Catherine respected that, even as her own motivation blended personal and moral imperatives more complexly. The sun began its westward descent as they continued their journey, casting longer shadows across the rugged terrain. In places, Swifthawk pointed out signs nearly invisible to untrained eyes, small markers left by Apache scouts tracking Blackwell's progress, subtle indications that others of their tribe moved through the landscape in parallel. Grey Dove sends many eyes to watch, he explained. The scarred one must not escape with papers that threaten water rights for our people. Catherine understood the existential nature of this concern. For the Apache, water meant survival in this harsh land. Any legal manipulation that diverted streams or claimed critical springs could devastate communities already pushed to marginal territories. Hours passed with minimal conversation as they maintained their grueling pace. When they finally reached a specific rock formation Swifthawk had been using as a landmark, he paused, studying Catherine with new appreciation. Most white men would be crawling by now, he observed. Even strong Apache warriors would show more fatigue. Catherine allowed herself a small smile. My body remembers what it learned when I was young, she said simply. The desert taught me endurance before I ever met your people. Swifthawk nodded understanding. The land chooses some to carry its strength. Grey Dove recognized this in you when others would have left the wounded white girl to die. As they continued, the landscape gradually transformed. Rocky heights, giving way to a series of descending terraces that would eventually lead to the approach for Eagle Pass. The light was fading rapidly now, the western sky painted in spectacular oranges and purples as the sun vanished behind distant mountains. Swifthawk led Catherine to a protected alcove within sight of their destination. The ancestor stones, 3 towering monoliths that stood like sentinels overlooking the pass. From this vantage point, they could observe both the approach routes Blackwell would be forced to take and the positions where Wilson's marshals would likely establish their ambush. We rest here, Swifthawk decided, producing small packets of pemmican, concentrated traveling food made of dried meat, fat and berries. Short sleep, then position before dawn. Catherine accepted the offered food with gratitude, settling into the natural shelter as Swifthawk arranged subtle barriers of brush that would prevent their small fire from being visible from below while reflecting heat into their resting area. As darkness claimed the land completely, Catherine found her thoughts turning to the confrontation ahead. Blackwell was more than just a horse thief or opportunistic criminal. His scarred face connected him to her earliest trauma. The Comanche raid that had claimed her parents, the desperate knife slash that had marked him before she was beaten. Unconscious, if he truly was that same raider, fate had drawn a strange circle, bringing them back together across the years. The teenage girl defending her family had become the legendary tracker. The Comanche raider had transformed into a sophisticated criminal mastermind. Both had evolved, changed by time and experience, yet still locked in the same fundamental conflict. You think deeply, Swifthawk observed, his voice low in the darkness. About circles, Catherine replied. How some journeys bring us back to their beginnings. The Apache nodded, understanding evident even in the firelight's subtle illumination. The scarred one. He is connected to your past. It wasn't a question, but Catherine answered anyway. I believe he was among those who killed my family when I was young, before your people found me. Swifthawk was silent for a long moment, absorbing this information. Then tomorrow is not just about a stolen horse or threatened water. No, Catherine admitted, but justice serves many purposes at once. Personal and public healing flow from the same spring. As she prepared for a few hours of rest, Catherine checked Wilson's Winchester one final time, ensuring it was clean and loaded. Tomorrow would bring the culmination of this strange journey, a confrontation 15 years in the making, though neither she nor Blackwell could have predicted its shape or context. Sleep came swiftly, despite the significance of what lay ahead. The Apache had taught her to rest when possible, to let the body restore itself without the mind's interference. In the morning, Ghost Feet would complete the hunt that had begun with Thunder's theft and extended backward through time to her earliest tragedy. Justice, like the ancient paths they traveled, sometimes took unexpected routes to reach its destination. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Catherine like a familiar cloak as she took position among the ancestor stones. Swift Hawk had guided her to this perfect vantage point overlooking Eagle Pass, then melted away to coordinate with other Apache scouts monitoring the approaches. From here, she could observe without being seen, a Winchester rifle resting comfortably across a natural stone shelf. Below, barely visible in the faint starlight, federal marshals had established their ambush positions. Catherine counted 8 men strategically placed to cover the pass from multiple angles. Wilson had positioned his forces well, understanding that Blackwell would be suspicious of any obvious trap. In the east, the faintest lightening of the sky heralded approaching dawn. Soon, the confrontation that had been building since Thunder's theft would reach its conclusion. Catherine's heightened senses detected movement before her eyes confirmed it. A subtle disturbance in the natural rhythms of the desert night. Riders, approaching cautiously from the north, still distant but drawing steadily closer. Blackwell and his remaining men right on schedule. She shifted position slightly, finding better coverage while maintaining her sightlines. The Winchester was a comfort, but Catherine knew better than to rely solely on firepower against experienced outlaws. Positioning, timing, and psychology would determine the outcome more than simple marksmanship. As the sky gradually lightened from black to deepest blue, details emerged from the landscape. Catherine could now make out 3 riders moving in tight formation, approaching Eagle Pass with evident caution. They paused periodically, studying the terrain ahead with field glasses, clearly alert for potential ambush. Blackwell led the group, his scarred face occasionally catching the first hints of coming dawn as he surveyed their route. Even at this distance, his bearing conveyed absolute authority, a man accustomed to command, to having his will enforced without question. The 2 men flanking him maintained protective positions, rifles ready across their saddles. The federal marshals remained perfectly concealed, their patience and discipline apparent in their absolute stillness. Wilson had trained them well for this moment. Catherine checked the position of the sun, still below the horizon, but painting the eastern sky with the first hints of gold. Timing would be critical too early, and the poor light might allow escape in the confusion too late, and Blackwell might spot the trap before it could be sprung. A flicker of movement from the rocks to her right caught Catherine's attention. Swift. Hawk signaling the presence of additional Apache warriors positioned to prevent escape through the rugged terrain bordering the pass. The net was fully deployed, waiting only for its prey to advance. Below, Blackwell's group had reached the approach to Eagle Pass. They halted again, more cautious now, as the confining nature of the terrain ahead became apparent. Catherine read the outlaw leader's hesitation in his posture, the way he repeatedly scanned the rocks above the pass. His instincts were warning him, even if his eyes detected nothing amiss. After a brief conference, one of Blackwell's men dismounted, leading his horse forward on foot to scout the pass, while the others waited. A prudent tactic, dividing potential fire while testing for ambush. The man moved with professional care, checking sightlines and potential hiding spots with methodical precision. Catherine held her position, knowing the marshals would do the same. Discipline would determine success, allowing the scout to report. Back, a false all clear would draw the main target fully into the trap. The scout completed his inspection of the visible portions of the pass, then signaled back to Blackwell. Even at this distance, Catherine could see the outlaw leader's dissatisfaction with the report. He clearly sensed danger, despite his man's reassurance. For a moment, it seemed Blackwell might retreat, seeking another route. Then, with evident reluctance, he gestured his group forward. Perhaps the documents he carried were too valuable to risk delay, or maybe alternate routes seemed equally dangerous. Whatever his reasoning, the decision was made. As they entered the narrowest portion of the pass, Wilson's voice suddenly rang out, amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone walls. "Ezra Blackwell, you're surrounded by federal marshals. Surrender your weapons and dismount immediately." The reaction was instantaneous, Blackwell's men dropping from their horses to take cover behind rocks while drawing weapons. Blackwell himself remained mounted for a crucial extra second, assessing the situation with remarkable composure before smoothly sliding from his saddle to shelter behind a large boulder. "Marshal Wilson," he called back, voice carrying clearly in the dawn stillness. "I was wondering when our paths would cross directly." "You're finished, Blackwell," Wilson responded. "Your operation is dismantled, your men arrested, your political protection exposed. There's no escape." A dry chuckle emanated from behind Blackwell's position. "There's always an escape, Marshal. The question is merely its cost." Catherine watched intently as Blackwell whispered instructions to his men. Their body language suggested disagreement, one man gesturing emphatically toward the eastern edge of the pass, while Blackwell pointed westward. A division in the ranks, perhaps, or a coordinated distraction being planned. "You have 1 minute to surrender before we open fire," Wilson announced, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The tension stretched as seconds ticked past. Then, with shocking suddenness, Blackwell's men opened fire simultaneously in different directions, not targeting specific marshals, but creating a chaotic pattern of shots that echoed confusingly through the pass. In the manufactured chaos, Blackwell himself broke cover, sprinting not toward either exit, but toward a seemingly solid rock wall on the southern side of the pass. Catherine instantly recognized his intent. He'd identified a narrow crevice, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it, that offered potential escape through the rocks. The marshals, focused on the gunfire from his men, hadn't spotted Blackwell's desperate gambit, but Catherine had. From her elevated position among the ancestor stones, the escape route was clearly visible, as was Blackwell's running figure. She raised the Winchester, leading her target slightly to account for his movement. Her finger tightened on the trigger, the shot perfectly aligned. Then she deliberately adjusted her aim, squeezing off a round that struck the rock wall inches from Blackwell's head. Startled, he stumbled to a halt, looking up toward the source of the unexpected shot. Catherine stood, revealing her position against the lightning sky. 15 years is a long time to wait for justice, she called down, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that followed her shot. Recognition dawned on Blackwell's face as he truly saw her for the first time. "The girl with the knife," he said, unconsciously touching the scar on his cheek. "You survived." "I did more than survive," Catherine replied, Winchester still trained steadily on his position. "I became the ghost these mountains whisper about when the wind changes." Blackwell's expression shifted through multiple emotions, shock, calculation, and finally a strange acceptance. "I've spent years building an empire," he said, "only to have it dismantled by a legend I dismissed as campfire tales." "Poetic isn't it," Catherine responded. "The man who took everything from me as a child, finally facing justice because he stole my horse." Federal marshals were converging on Blackwell's position now, having subdued his men during this exchange. Wilson approached, cautiously, revolver trained on the outlaw leader. "The documents," he demanded. "Where are they?" Blackwell's laugh held no humor. "In my saddlebags, Marshal. All the evidence you need to dismantle what remains of my operation. A lifetime's work rendered worthless in a day." As Wilson secured the valuable documents, Catherine maintained her position above, watching as marshals handcuffed the man whose actions had shaped so much of her life. Blackwell looked up at her one final time. "I've been hunted by posses, marshals, and rival gangs," he called. "None found me until you set your mind to it. The Apache named you well." Catherine didn't respond, merely watching as he was led away. The confrontation felt strangely anticlimactic. No dramatic shootout, no extended struggle. Just the quiet closing of a circle that had begun 15 years ago with a desperate knife slash from a terrified young girl. Swift Hawk materialized beside her as the marshals secured their prisoners. "It is finished," he observed. "Yes," Catherine agreed, finally lowering the Winchester. "Justice sometimes takes the long path, but it arrives eventually." The sun created the eastern mountains, flooding Eagle Pass with golden light. In that illumination, Catherine could see Wilson looking up toward her position, offering a respectful nod, before turning to organize his men for the journey back to civilization. "Will you return to your ranch now?" Swifthawk asked. "To your stallion and your peaceful life?" Catherine considered the question as she watched the federal party begin their departure, Blackwell and his men securely bound and mounted on their own horses. "Yes," she finally said, "though perhaps that life will be different now." "How so?" "Thunder and I have unfinished work," she explained. "There are still honest settlers being preyed upon, still innocent people needing protection. Perhaps Ghost Feet shouldn't fade back into legend quite yet." Swift Hawk's expression remained stoic, but his eyes conveyed understanding. "The desert remembers your footsteps," he said simply. "The mountains will welcome your return whenever you choose to walk their ancient paths." As they began their journey back to Broken Finger Rocks, where thunder waited, Catherine felt a profound sense of completion. The cycle that began with loss had transformed into purpose, then justice, and finally choice. The stolen horse had led her back to her true self, not just the grieving widow or the legendary tracker, but something uniquely blended from both experiences. Ghost Feet would ride, again, but on her own terms. And any outlaws hearing that name whispered around campfires would do well to remember. Sometimes legends are more than stories. Sometimes they're warnings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.